So in Chapter 1, Lesson 4, we're going to talk about loops, and we're going to add to the first two. Remember, the first two principles that we talked about, one was smooth acceleration to an appropriate stop, and the second one is no slack. The third one, it's super important, just as important as the other two, is that it's really critical for a caster to understand that the loop is going to be determined by the rod tip path. So if the loop is a big wide loop, it has a particular rod tip path. It has a narrow loop, it has a different kind of rod tip path. A tailing loop has a different rod tip path. Wherever your rod tip is going during the course of your casting stroke and where it ends is going to determine the shape, the size, the direction of your loop, and what happens to your fly line. So that's an extremely important task for us to understand, and an important principle for us to understand. So we're going to do a little bit of demonstration so you can understand that principle a little bit more. Let's show a couple of loops and make some definitions of some loops, and then the type of rod tip path that they actually, what rod tip path creates these loops. This is a narrow loop. This is the rod, and it's just stopped right here, and it's had sufficient motion and speed, acceleration, to when it stops, the line keeps going and starts to create a loop. If you look at this, all loops, or most loops anyway, the good, better loops have parallel sides. So this is the bottom leg, or the rod leg of the loop. This is the top leg, or the fly leg of the loop. And you can see that those two sides are fairly parallel. And this is a narrow loop. This loop is caused by a fairly straight line rod tip path, which we're going to demonstrate a little bit later in this video. You'll notice that the nose on this loop is pretty small. It's the radius right here is pretty small, which means it's going to be very efficient when it turns over. This loop, a narrow loop, is good for distance casting, accuracy, speed, dry fly fishing, smaller other flies that don't have a lot of weight. This is a good loop a lot of times, but it's not the only good loop. It depends on the situation. Just remember the narrow loop, that's an efficient loop caused by a straight line or nearly straight line rod tip path. Now let's take a look at this. This loop is a much wider loop. So this loop is a big wide loop. You can see that it still has fairly parallel sides. It's still got about the same shape, but instead of being a foot across, it's now, or a foot high, it's now about 4.5 feet from the bottom leg or rod leg to the fly leg or top leg. And you can also notice that the nose of it is much bigger. So this is going to be less efficient. This loop is not going to be as efficient in terms of speed and accuracy into the wind as a narrow loop. But it's got its uses. This kind of loop is really valuable for heavy flies, for sink tip lines, for rigs that have a lot of flies on them, like a multiple nymph rig. This is the kind of loop you may well want to create for those kinds of situations. This is caused by a rainbow-shaped rod tip path, which we're going to demonstrate in a second. So this loop is a little bit different loop. It's got different uses, but it's still a good loop. This loop, however, is a bad loop. This loop has very few redeeming qualities. And that's when your top leg or your fly leg dips down below your rod leg. If the straight line rod tip path causes the top leg to be here, it's dipped. And so we're going to show that. This one is the one that causes so-called wind knots. It tangles your flies. Even if it doesn't, it's still very efficient because your line is going in too many different directions. So we want to avoid this loop. So what we're going to do next is show you the rod tip path on the ground so you can kind of see it. And then we're going to get in the air and show you the rod tip path and the loop at the same time. So let's take a look at this. If we've got a casting arc or amount of line that requires a casting arc from this red cone to that red cone, and you can see the two white yardsticks, that's about the size of the casting arc or the piece of pie. And if we were to swing our rod from this red cone to that red cone without any rod bend, you can see that it goes way above the straight line. This is the straight line right here. But if we were to do that without any rod bend, we get this. So what happens, because we have enough line, what's going to happen is that this is actually, I'm going to kind of tilt it so you can see the rod bend a little better. But what happens is as you cast, that weight of that line bends the rod, and the tip actually follows a fairly straight line. So this is what we're talking about when we talk about a straight line rod tip path. That rod tip path is going to make a narrow loop. Now, what happens if we take these yardsticks, we had them right here, this was the loop, this was what we had before, and what happens if we do this? We open up our piece of pie. Same amount of line, but we open up our piece of pie to here. If we open up our piece of pie, instead of being here, we're now here. And we have the same amount of rod bend. So I'm going to have the same amount of rod bend, but now what? Look at the tip. Watch the yarn at the tip of the tip of the rod. Okay, now I start to bend. I come up to here, starts to unbend, and it comes to here. What happens? You've actually got a more rainbow-shaped rod tip path. That's going to cause a bigger, wider loop. Now, let's take another one. So that's going to be a rainbow-shaped rod tip path that's going to cause a wide loop. So let's take a look at this one. What if you're going along and everything's going fine, and then you spike your power, you punch it, you jab at it, and it drops the rod tip down below, and then back up again. That's going to cause a tailing loop. That could happen early, and then later, that would cause a tailing loop. You can cause a tailing loop by going along very nicely, and then towards the end, you punch it, and it comes up. That's going to cause a tailing loop. A tailing loop can also be caused by other things besides just an inappropriate application of force or acceleration. But in the end, the bottom line for every tailing loop is caused by a dip in the rod tip path. So we're going to talk more about those later. And you can check out the CI tasks on tailing loops to see if you're interested in what exactly causes tailing loops. So there we go. That's our loop lesson. Just remember, the single biggest factor that creates the size of a loop and the shape of a loop is its rod tip path. So now we're going to show you some rod tip paths and have you look at the rod tip path and see the loop simultaneously.